Welcome to Syntax. Today we have Tim Neutkens on from Vercel, Next.js, co-author of Next.js, to talk to us all about everything that's going on with React, with Next.js 15, with server components, with React compiler, with Turbopack. Kind of a lot going on in this whole space recently. So I thought, let's bring him on to talk about it. So welcome, Tim. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Where should we start this off?
We could start off with some of the hottest new stuff, which would, I guess, be the compiler. So, I guess first and foremost, I know, this is a React thing and not a Next.js thing, but I'm sure you all are very tightly integrated into this. What does the React compiler do for those people who might not be aware of what it is and what it does?
Yeah, so if you watched the recent ReactConf keynote, if you haven't watched it, I'd highly recommend you to watch it, because it's definitely a much better explanation than I will ever be able to do, I think.
Yeah.
But in essence, it's in 2018, React hooks were introduced. There were a whole lot of hooks, right? So use state, use memo, that kind of thing. But really, in the end, they didn't have the ergonomics that you want eventually, when you're writing this code. So they were created in a way that you can incrementally get rid of them if you were to build a compiler at some point. That's really what the React team did. So they went ahead on a pretty long journey. I'm not sure exactly how long they've been working on it exactly.
Many years, I think. Yeah.
Something like 4 years, which also causes people to doubt will ever come, right? Are we ever going to have suspense, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But now in the last 2-3 weeks ago, they announced that the React compiler is now both open source, so you can view the source code, and it's in beta, so you can try it out. They didn't recommend you to ship it to production yet, but they are shipping it to production themselves in Instagram and a bunch of other places at Meta to really dogfood the system. That gives you exposure to a lot of different types of code, right? So it's similar to anytime you start building compiler that transforms the original source code into something else, there will be edge cases, and they're trying to catch all those edge cases. So that's why it's released early, so people can try it out.
Okay.
And really, what is it? Which is the initial question. It basically does memoization for you automatically. And not just for the basic case is I have a value that is derived based on some state or some basically the things that you would usually call use memo for, that kind of thing. Those are the things that I can, having some React knowledge, I can manually add them and make rendering better, right? Don't re-render this thing, but it goes much further than that. So it goes into I was talking to someone on the Vercel team that works on the Vercel website recently. I was showing him the React compiler side to side to what if you don't have it enabled. He was I thought this is always how React worked already. So why are you showing me this new thing? So another way that I look at it is it makes the assumptions that you had around how React renders a bit more the reality with the compiler. Because you don't have to think about where do I add memo, where do I add use callback, where do I make sure that things don't re-render, and instead I can just write my product logic, and compiler can figure out, does this thing need to be memoized, does it not need to be memoized? Because the other side of things early optimizations, you're at some point you get so into React that you get over this, it's this meme where you go to peak and then back to not memoizing anything, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
So at some point you're I know React so well, I'm going to memorize everything. I'm going to manually add use memo everywhere, use callback everywhere, because I don't want anything to change between renders. And that's not always the best way to do it in the end. So the React compiler can just take your original source code. It can basically optimize it in various ways by memoizing more bits. So it's not just the state being memoized or specific derived state as well, but it's more it can memorize your JSX as well, for example. So in some cases when some input values change, only a part of your JSX tree needs to change.
Oh, okay.
And it can like automatically make sure that those cases are also not re-rendering in this case.
Okay, that's one question I had, and I haven't been able to figure this out. Is like when people have like context, you put the context in like a provider, and when the values in context change, the entire subtree of context will re-render itself, right? And that's always been the thing, is like, oh, don't put context too high, but and then I tell myself, well, I kind of want it high because I just want my data where I want it, and I want it to figure it out for me. Is that something that the React compiler is going to fix for us?
So the lesser known one is that so it doesn't fix that, I think. I'm not 100% familiar with this, so like don't pin me down a little bit. I don't think it fixes the context one, but it does fix the other case, which is like prop drilling. So when you're writing an app that is like I get like a prop that I'm passing through, for example.
Yeah.
Anytime the prop changes, obviously the component needs to re-render. But then like if the prop is only used in like one place, for example, like in like you have two components that are next to each other, and like you only pass the prop to this like other component, it would also re-render the first component that doesn't use a prop, because of like completely re-rendering the entire tree under the component. With these changes, it doesn't actually do that anymore. And it's like more like, this is what I was saying, like it feels more like the natural way you would expect it to go, which is like, I'm not using this prop here, so it doesn't re-render, but actually did re-render previously.
Yeah, that's always been a bit of a hang up for me on React, is that you have to know about these little gotchas where like you said, like you have an application, and maybe you have like a sidebar, a navigation, and you pass a prop, maybe like current page or something like that, into your application. You don't actually know that it's re-rendering. And I think a lot of people are probably have code in production right now where they don't know that it could possibly, and maybe this is the next question, is like, what happens if you're not using this type of thing? Is it performance issues?
Yeah, so it will depend. Like, if you have like smaller apps and like smaller component trees, like it's less likely that you'll see problems per se. It's more of an like optimization that you just get for free. On larger apps, and like that was the case that they gave for Instagram, for example, it would just like output code that is more performant than any like engineer going manually like optimizing it. And if you look at there's a playground as well. That one shows you each individual step of the compilation and like how it optimizes it. And if you look at the output, it's just like output that you would never write yourself. Like it's stuff that is like use memo on my JSX, and like not exactly, but like that is the conceptual way you could think of it if you don't have the playground in front of you right now. So it's like just things that you would never do yourself, or like usually you would never do yourself, or you're at this like peak, I'm going to memorize everything. When the React compiler goes stable, right? Because right now it's still in beta. Once it goes stable, you won't have to think about this anymore. And like there's some optimizations that it doesn't do today, but there's some that are like when you like put in some input code, you're like, oh wait, this is things that I could have done myself, but I'm actually not doing. So like one example is you define a variable like const a is 10, like a string or integer that you put in. That's just like constant, right?
Yeah.
It can actually like reason about that and like move it into the place where it's used, instead of like having it in the function scope where it is continuously like reinstantiated because of the like re-rendering, for example.
Yeah, that's one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize, is that if you have like, if you need like a little function inside of your component, because like you like handle submit or something like that, right? If you define that function inside of your component, which a lot of people want to do because you have access to your state and everything else there, and you don't have to pass it all in, then every single time that component is re-rendered, then that function is reinstantiated. And then unless you're using like a use callback, and like it gets really complex really, really quickly. And I'm really glad that this will do that tricky stuff for us.
Yeah. Let's take it back to Next.js for a second too. Like, given that you said this stuff's all in preview and it's coming from the React team, does Next need any modifications to take advantage of this stuff once it is launched, or are people going to be able to use this with whatever compatible Next.js version with the React version when it's fully released?
Yeah, for sure. Like you have to. So it's using some APIs that are in React that are also not available in like React 18, for example. So like you'll have to use React 19. So like today you have to install like React 19 RC. If you're using AppWriter, you don't have to install like React itself because we ship with like the version of React that you need. But in practice, you need React 19 because of like specific APIs. There is a polyfill for it, but like generally speaking, probably don't want to use it. Just use the like latest React instead. And and then the thing you have to do in Next is that like it's using a Babel transform today. Important thing to note is like it's not a Babel like a transform in the sense that you would usually think of like I'm going to take my input and give some output. It does generate some output, but in between there's like a different compiler that is like has reasoning about like Babel AST, but it could also support like SWC in the future or like any other like parsing and like AST transform basically. So on that side, like it means that we have to add Babel because like we've been on this journey to move away from Babel for like compilation for Next.js using SWC instead, which is significantly more performant for like individual file compiles. But now we have to add back Babel for this case at least until they like start like a REST rewrite or something like that. That's already been experimented with by the team as well, by the React team. In practice, like if you're using Next.js, all you have to do is upgrade to the React 50 or the Next.js 15 RC and upgrade to React 19. Which is something that it will just tell you to upgrade because like we also depend on that. And then you have to enable experimental React compiler true and install the compiler because like compiler right now is in beta. So we want to make sure that you can upgrade it yourself so you can get like the latest improvements to it whenever you want instead of like being in lockstep with Next.js itself.
Yeah, that doesn't sound too painful at all. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's talk about React server components. I'm sure that you're probably one of the top people in the world who's heard so much of the feedback, good and bad, from React server component world. And I think there's like a lot of confusion around what it is. So are you able to give us a quick, your idea of what React server components is and how we should be approaching our applications?
Yeah, it's definitely it's been a hard one to explain to people, as you've probably seen online. So we released server components in Next.js like 1.5 years ago, or like slightly over 1 year ago now. 1.5 years ago for like the initial like beta release of it. We could try it out for the first time. I really like React server components are like it's said in the name, but like you render React components on the server. Slightly different from what you did before. So like Next.js, since the very first version, had server-side rendering. Server-side rendering is like taking React components, generating HTML. React server components is more of a like step before that basically replaces everything that you did with get server-side props, get static props, and then like it's able to render React components as part of that. There's a much better and like deeper and like more high level explanation of this in Dan's talk at ReactConf. Would definitely recommend looking at that. And that one talks about like React for two computers, which is like I'm running React on two computers. Like one computer is the server basically, and it doesn't start out there, but like that's where I don't want to spoil the entire talk. But it's like you basically end up with like. You have one computer is your server, the other computer is the browser, and you can move logic between them in like whatever way you want, because everything is one rendering model. So you're still using React. You use like pretty much everything that you're familiar with. The only difference is that now React has this primitive that allows us to render on the server only, which is like something that we couldn't do before. That unlocks some other benefits. So like one of them is that you can now do data fetching on the server, where you don't need like special like framework APIs. So like we initially coined the get initial props pattern, where you can do like data fetching on the server and on the client, and then like later on added like get server side, get static props, get server side props, get static props. Get server side props was just like a way to say before my React rendering starts, I'm going to get like the framework is going to call this function, and then like I, as the application developer, can like write some logic that gets data from anywhere. So like it could be a database or like an API or anything like that. And then we pass those as props into the component. Now with server components, that step is basically like replaced with a full React render. So that means I can write components. Those components can do data fetching, and they can render other components as well as like interactive components that are like the ones that you wrote before. So if you're familiar with React, like it's just an additive feature basically on top of everything that you already knew that allows you to do even more than we would ever like have hoped for when we started Next.js, for example.
Yeah.
Which is like, I can now do data fetching in my components or like deeper into the React tree. I could share like libraries that do data fetching and like provide components for that. And it's fully portable in the React ecosystem as well once like more frameworks start adopting this. So one example of that is like Remix is looking into server components. The Redwood folks are looking into server components. And like at that point, you basically have a React component you can write that is encapsulating both like client-side behavior as well as server-side behavior. And like one example of that is I can build a like MySQL admin type React component.
Yeah.
And that's portable between like all frameworks that use React server components. And I can pass in like props there, and they can be interactive as well, right? You can add like interactions using server actions or things like that as well.
Yeah, it's really exciting to me that we'll now be able to ship components that define how does it work on the client, how does it get its data, and how does it render on the server, all inside of an encapsulated component. Because one of the things that people who build like websites for clients they're still saying, I want like the WordPress plugin experience, right?
Yeah, right.
And that has always been really tricky to like move to the React world. But now with this idea of like, yeah, you can npm install something and it's batteries included for all of that. Maybe you pass in tokens or auth or something like that. It's pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, it's really cool to see the like obviously like when we just released it, there was like a lot of like pushback, like, oh, things are getting more complicated. Why do I need to know about this use client thing, or like what are client components even? Why is this a new thing? And like those were not even like the new thing, right? So they were like the thing that you already had. Just give it a name, basically, right? And then server components were the fully new thing where you had to be like, I want to use state, right? Like, let me call use state so that I can like click this button and then like something is like shown or something like that. But you can't do that on the server because like obviously the server like doesn't have this interaction model of being able to like render and then like re-render at some point as part of like running on the server. So there's like new constraints on that environment, and that was like what was like especially confusing to people coming from like, I'm only using like client-side React and then like moving to I can only do certain things on the server type thing. One of the cool things that we're seeing now at this point is that the like some of the CMS providers, for example, are starting to look into how can I provide better components? How can I provide like RSC enabled features? Like one great example is like Payload CMS is like building their entire editor as React server components with server actions and all that. So what they allow you to do is like they allow you to bring the entire CMS as a React component. So you can like pull that in, give it a config, and the config is like you define your React components, and it could be like client components as well. And those can adjust behavior in the CMS itself. So you can like build like override particular like fields in the CMS, which is really cool to see as well. Similarly, like Sanity is doing something like that as well. It's just like we're finally at the stage where like people are like coming around to it and they're like seeing, okay, this thing actually does make sense for my case, or it still doesn't make sense for my case, but maybe only the client-side navigation optimizations or like specific features of React that are like enabled by this, like transitions and things like that. And it definitely feels like the ReactConf, like if you're into React, I highly recommend like watching literally all the talks, like the entire live stream, which is like 8 hours long. All of them were super high quality. I did it myself. Don't do it in one sitting, I would say, but like generally speaking, Like the talk that Dan gave clarified like server components click for me now. It's like the general thing I heard from people. And similarly, like you're seeing like other like explanations of like how is this like making sense to me now in like my particular case. So even if you're building like an SPA, you can still leverage like suspends and transitions and like async transitions, for example, to make it easier to like schedule work and things like that.
What does that look like for somebody who has built an entire application that is maybe a Next.js and it's client hydrated, right? And they say, okay, well now I want to start opting in to server components. I think that's where a lot of the frustration from people go, because they go, I'm going to start using server components, and then you import something that has a hook in it or is meant for the client, and you get all these errors, and people get really frustrated with it, right? What's the path? Like, what do you recommend for somebody when they're moving over?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the misconception is like where you start migrating. So like the where you start migrating is like usually people are like, I'm going to use this for this small component on the page that is like a button that doesn't need interactivity, right? Or something like that. However, the entire model is built on the other way around. Like you're introducing server components at the place where get server-side props was. So that's like before the actual like client components rendering. What that means is that if you want to start migrating, the first place where you start is not so much at this like granular level per se. It's more the outer layer of the app. So when you start migrating, the first thing that you do, and there's many ways to do this, but like the first thing that you usually do is like you go into like page.tsx or page.js. Usually people like TypeScript nowadays, but like you can still use JavaScript as well if you want. The first thing you do is like you add, because you already have this page.tsx, or like maybe you're using pages router and it's like index.js or something like that.
Yeah.
So you create this page.tsx and you don't add use client there. What you do instead is you write a component and then you import another component, and in that component you add use client. Okay. So what that means is that now the outer layer is a server component, and the inner like component that you're rendering in that server component is a client component.
Okay, so basically you're taking your page and you're saying this page is server rendered. Now I'm going to opt in everything to client, right? You say use client. That's kind of, I was moving my own website over to it, and I was like, all right, I just need it to work. So I made everything use client, and then you can keep going on that, but I started chipping away at it.
Yeah, that's a great, when you're migrating anything, to get the versions up and then get the site at least back to where it was before opting into the new stuff, I think is always a good strategy.
For me, it was like a mental hurdle where I was like, no, I don't want it. I want it all to be server rendered. But then I was telling myself, Wes, the whole freaking website was client rendered previously.
Yeah.
It's okay to go back to the whole website being client rendered as
incrementally.
You opt into each of them. So like once you're at a page server rendered, then how do you handle that page?
So yeah, like the migration story, you already have a website like Syntax, for example, which was built on Next.js before. You basically just take that like page you had in the pages router, and usually that one had get static props or get server-side props. So the way to think about it is that the component you're adding as like page.tsx, that one is the one that is doing the get server-side props or get static props that you previously did. So instead of like having the specific like export function get server-side props, what you do now is you move all that logic into this async server component that is the page itself. So you move all that logic down, and then you create a separate component that is just the thing that was like rendering before. And that separate component you add use client, and you pass all the props in, same way that get server-side props passes them in, like that we do in like Next.js internals, basically, right? Which is just like you pass the props. Like literally, you just add a props object there. You spread onto the item. Then like the next step there is there's many ways to do this, but like you can say maybe that first component that is using the props is also not interactive. It doesn't have use client, or it doesn't need use client because it doesn't have use state, it doesn't use effects or anything like that. So what you do at that point is you say, I move it down one more level, right? So like now we're down to maybe if that page was like the shell of the page, like the header, the content, and then the footer. maybe only the content doesn't need it, but the header and the footer do need like some interactivity that is like use state or use effect. So what you do at that point is you just move the use client like deeper and deeper until the point where you're like, it doesn't really make sense anymore to do this. And then for the first like iteration of it, you're done at that point. I think at least that's my opinion on like migrating like these Next.js apps. The misconception that people have is like, my Next.js app in Pages Writer is bad. I need to move to App Writer to then like move everything to the server. You don't have to do that. You can just use like client components. Client components are fine. I think in the when we released server components in Next.js, like we talked so much about what server components can do that like it was lost that like client components are fine and they're part of the same model and you should be using them still. Like there's no reason that the interactivity of like clicking buttons or opening menus or popovers or anything like that is server-side behavior. You can still use all the features of React. Client components are totally fine, basically, right? So at that point, you're done for now. And then what you can do from that point on is like you can say, maybe some of the things that are in my header are actually things I can render on the server, and they need data from the server. So what you do initially is you're passing, like maybe you're fetching all the data for the page, which is what you did in get source props, get static props. You're passing all the data from the page like down into these like other components, right? So you're passing into your header component, hey, this is the data for the header, for example. So what you can do at that point is you can move the data fetching further down. Or like if that is at all possible. It doesn't have to be that way, right? Like you can also say, I'm still going to do all my data fetching at the top, but you do get some benefits from moving them down at that stage. So at that stage, you can say, I'm going to introduce suspense boundaries to show more like loading states in my page, for example. My content can come in later than the header, for example, that kind of thing. So what you can do at that point is you can introduce suspense boundaries like slightly deeper in the tree, while the rest is still client components. Then you already get a slightly better experience because you can get the header, the footer, but then like the content has a loading state, like a skeleton or like some kind of like spinner, anything you want really, because you can provide your own loading state there. But like at that point, you've already improved the experience of your app. It streams in like faster. You get like faster time to first byte, slightly better core web vitals, that kind of thing. And then you can say, maybe I need to start moving some of my other like parts of the header, for example, to be partially server components, partially client components. So one of the very interesting things is that it's a one-way street. Like it's like a door, which is like a hole to the other side of to the other machine, to the other computer, which is the client. So now you can say in my server components, I can pass data to my client components, right? I can pass data to the browser, for example. Even though they're still like rendered HTML on the server, I can just like pass these props that it's similar to what get server props did, right? So you just like do some data fetching and you pass it to the browser as well. And if you ever looked at a Next.js app, you would see like __ next data, and that would have like a large blob of like all your data for get server props. Server components to client components. Yeah.
Sorry, I want to talk about that for just a little bit because I think that's really neat. For the longest time, I was like, I really wish Next.js would come out with like a state management or like a data fetching library or some opinionated way to fetch data and pass it to the client. Yeah, and for the longest time, I was like, can they please do this? And then server components came out and Next.js had this like revalidate tag, revalidate path, cache API. And I thought like, I'm not sure I need that anymore because you can make a server component fetch the data and you can pass it to the client component via props and you can clear that data with revalidate tag. And I went from wanting this like Redux type store on the server or on the client server to it's just a fetch request with props. Was that do you see a lot of people saying that?
Yeah, I think that started with the get static props, get server props already a bit. There was like a lot of like cases that you could model in this way. The only thing that was missing was like a primitive for what do I do when I do interactions. So like interactions could be like client-side interactions, like state and like effects and like on-click and that kind of thing, or it could be interactions that involve the server. So like things that are like submitting a form or things like that. So we never had a like strong opinions on what form library to use or like how to call forms. Like what we told you instead is like get server-side props for fetching data is like the get part. We never had the post part, right? Like we never had the like how do I post stuff to the server?
Yeah.
We introduced API routes for that. So API routes was like Pages API. You put something in there, you get like a Node.js request response handler, and then you can do pretty much anything you want because it's just like a Node.js request response handler, kind of like Express basically, right? And that allows you to like write some logic that's like update the database. However, then you have to model this like logic of like I write to the database, but now I need to get the new state back to the client, right? So now at that point, you're like, I fetch the API, I get a response back. Now I have to read the response body and then like do some mutation on the client-side state. That model is fine overall. And like if you have an external API or anything like that, you can still do that with AppWriter. Like there's nothing wrong with that as well.
Yeah.
You can totally build that. You can even like use the server components to seed the data in and then like have like SWR, React Query or anything like that to like revalidate the data and do fetches there and that kind of thing. And then it's like more like what we did with get server-side props, right? Like initial data and then you can like update it on the client side.
Mm-hmm.
However, we also wanted to provide like a better way to do the entire cycle. So like the entire cycle is I render a page, you request a page, I give you the page, and now you want to like search or like submit some form or anything like that. And for that, we worked with the React team and some of the folks that work at Vercel on the React team as well to basically like figure out like what does this better API for this look like. So there was like some prior art like remix loaders that have like post functionality. There's like SvelteKit that has like a similar like actions type primitive. And we were like, yeah, this makes sense, but I also don't think it makes sense for like just for Next.js, right? Like we don't want to have like a primitive in like Next.js itself that is like we no longer need primitives for like data fetching. Why don't we also have primitives for like mutations, right? Like how do I do some kind of like it eventually was named actions, right? So like how do I do some action that either updates the database or updates some like state or anything like that. When that is done, I see the state reflected in the UI. And really, that's like a hard problem, right? So like on the surface, it sounds like an easy problem. It's like I just fetch the API, I set the state, and then it's done. But then you forget the like my database is down, my API response wave of 500, maybe like a network connection is bad and it just like cancels and we have to retry and like all those like tiny things that you have to think about.
Yeah, it's edge case all the way down.
And they're all not integrated into React. So like React is not aware of like any of that.
Yeah.
It just like knows about the onClick or the onSubmit. And the onSubmit is also not tied into React. So once I throw an error in my onSubmit, it doesn't actually, like, it just goes into the void, basically. It goes into Sentry. That's like the,
there we go.
Thing. Just plug in Sentry here. And that is the thing that we wanted to solve, right? So like there was this like interplay between maybe I want to show like optimistic state, maybe I want no optimistic state, which can be the case as well. Maybe I want to submit and only show like the new state once it actually is fully done and rendered. And how does that tie into the server story, right? Like how does this tie into going back to the server and like getting some result back? And that's where we eventually like added, saying that was like collaboration between like React team, Next.js team, and like a bunch of others on like this API to basically like give us the ability to like we have this door from the server to the client, but now we have a door back from the client to the server, and that door is 2 ways. So the interesting thing there is you can like pass data, but in the same request, it can actually give you back the entire rendered like news, like the new page as well. And that's why we introduced like and this is Next.js specific, so like revalidate pod, revalidate tag. if you call those in the server action, what happens is that once you add a form that takes your name, for example,
and
you click submit, it will call that server action, which is like a function that runs on the server. But if you call revalidate pod at that point, it can actually re-render the page, like the page that you're specifying, to also have to basically re-render the entire page. So at that point, it means that in single round trip, you can submit new data, update the database, and then automatically trigger Next.js to basically say, hey, render the entire page again, because there's new data, right? Like the data has changed. And then we can send it back and update the page in place.
Yeah, I love that API. I don't love the page API as much as I love the revalidate tag. And for anyone listening, the way that it works is that when you have a fetch request that is off to get some data, you can pass it some tags. You can tag it as like, let's say you have like a show, right? I could tag it as a show. I could tag it as a show in the specific category. I could tag it like you can go very, very broad, which is like show, and you can go very specific, kind of like React query, where you can tag them as much as you want, and then you can revalidate, meaning that say anyone on the client side or any pages that are currently open with that, tell it to go. I don't know if it's telling it to go refetch it or it's bringing back the data directly to it. And I really like that because it doesn't tie me to a specific page. React server components where the fetching happens in the component and the revalidation can happen in the component. I don't have to worry about what specific page this thing is on.
Yeah, I had a question. You mentioned a couple of times that, working closely with the React team, and I know that there are React team members at Vercel. How tightly does the Next.js team work with the React team typically? Is that like a really close partnership? Is it
you guys got a chat room or what's going on?
Yeah, what's going on there? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really not secretive at all. It's just like, we have some folks like Sebastian, Andrew, and Josh that work on the React team. It's a separate team, so it's not part of Next.js in the org chart, but we're like next to each other in the org chart at Vercel. That's the React team at Vercel, right? So there's React team itself is many external contributors as well as the folks at Meta that are working on React compiler, React Native, that kind of thing. And a lot of the technical implementation side of things for some of the new features that you've seen have come out of Vercel as well. Like some of the more well known, but also the lesser known ones. So if you've seen Josh was part of the keynote who works at Vercel. He gave a talk on what was called React Float. One of the secretive code names, but that was the thing that allows you to move any element that should be in the head to the head. Mm-hmm. So if you've used React Helmet or Next Head or anything like that before, it's just part of React now, and you don't have to think about it. And you don't have to think about it in so many ways that are so complicated. It's reason about that that you couldn't make it work before. There was the only way that we could do it was making it part of React itself.
Yeah.
And that the reason for that is streaming. So for rendering the entire page, it was fine. But now that we have streaming, there's a specific constraints that we have that allow us to basically say we need to start streaming the head early on, but then we need to fill in the blanks later, basically. And adding a feature into React for that was super important because now all frameworks can just they don't no longer have to worry about this. In migrating to React Server components, we removed so many features from Next.js that we previously had to manually juggle, basically head management, injecting script tags, injecting CSS, that kind of thing is all handled by React itself now. Mm-hmm. And that brings many benefits. So one of them is that you get suspensy CSS or suspensy images and scripts, which means that React can hold off rendering anything until the CSS is actually loaded.
Yeah.
And that was one of the issues that we had a ton because we would inject into the head, for example, and then we would assume that it is loaded at some point, but we
Yeah.
can't really like hold on, like we can't tell React like, hey, don't render, right? Like React is in charge of rendering. So that was like one of the main things that like we ended up contributing to React itself. Async transitions were like one that like Andrew works on a bunch. So we end up like talking like day to day, like our teams end up talking quite often, and that's mostly because of like behaviors that like our teams ran into while implementing some of these features that React team has thought of and want to implement. And a lot of it's like ironing out like APIs and does it actually make sense and that kind of thing. And then we also have the like similar to Meta, like we're also dogfooding like Next.js at Vercel itself. So like Vercel is using like almost always the latest version of Next.js.
Oh, cool.
And that brings like issues with it as well, because like obviously we're the first ones to hit bugs and that kind of thing.
But man.
In doing so, we also can prevent like other people running into them using like early release cycles and that kind of thing. So I would say like overall, React team is pretty large. We end up like talking to other like people inside of React team for some of the like server components and like server actions and transition stuff. Like I end up talking to Andrew and Josh quite a bit. Sebastian is like more doing like architecture work, so like making sure that like he architected the app writer as well. So we worked a bunch together on like, what does this writer look like? How does this thing tie into React server components? Like no one had built a writer that's like compatible with server components yet at that point. So we had to like figure out and transitions as well, by the way. So like React transitions was like a specific thing that we had support for, like concurrent rendering, that kind of thing. So we ended up like building a special writer that wasn't like that hadn't been done before. There's like not a lot of prior art on looking at this, except for like what they built at Meta as well for like their website. Yeah,
that's good. Do you know what the status or any hangups on getting async client components happening? Because now that you can await a fetch before you render and that component can suspend itself on the server is amazing. And I know React 19 brought us a bunch of APIs that make that type of thing a little bit easier, but me and Scott were talking about it on an episode. We kind of like look at it like, wouldn't it be nicer just to be able to await before you return the value? Do you know when and if we will get async client components?
Yeah, I don't know when. I don't know. I know if it's like, as far as I'm aware, they want to add it.
Yeah.
But and I'm pretty sure I'm not leaking anything with this.
No. I've asked publicly before, and they say yes, it is the plan to make them work on the client as well. As
far as I remember, I'm not fully in the know on this, but like as far as I remember, the latest like blocker on this was async context.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've seen that proposal, but it's basically like async local storage, which is not local storage. Like the quick explanation is async local storage is a way to basically pass data across like the async context stack. The way that I've explained it to people is like, it's kind of like React context, where you can like pass values like somewhere higher up in the like tree of like the JavaScript running, and then you can read those values further down. And async context is the official proposal for like bringing that into the JavaScript spec. Right. I'm not sure why that is a blocker per se, and like if that even is a blocker.
Yeah, I wasn't understanding why that was a blocker to have it, but
I think it has something to do with like re-rendering and like if you create a promise, that promise needs to fully resolve at some point, and that needs to be tracked in some way. But I'm not sure exactly. Like I'm not in the know on this.
Okay,
I should say, yeah.
The async local storage API is really cool. So I've been working on my course platform, which was heavily reliant on Express middleware, and I'm thinking to myself, all right, I'm going to move off Express eventually, and what happens is I'll have a middleware where I'll attach like a user ID or I'll attach like a country, and then I'll move on to the actual handler, and then you assume that data is in the request. So I moved a lot of that out of sticking it into the request and then pulling it out. I moved that into the async local storage API, because then it's just, as long as it's in the call stack, right? It's available to you. And Next.js uses that as well for cookies and headers. You simply just call,
what's
the API?
Yeah, it's literally cookies and
Cookies.
headers. So you call cookies or you call headers, and you get like a cookie store, header store back, like header object. React uses it for the cache API as well, like the new like the one that you can call to dedupe in the same rendering on the server. I think it's like part of that actually. Like the React cache doesn't work in the same way if you do like across this rendering basically. So that might be one of the blockers, because otherwise, like if you do data fetching and you want to dedupe it in some way, you just can't, because it's just not like tracking that in this way. So maybe something like that. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Okay. We got 10 minutes left. I got a lot I want to ask you about here.
That's what I was looking through here. Our questions were like 10% of the way through the ones that we had written down beforehand.
I think if we could touch really quickly on Turbopack, like what it is and what problems it's going to solve, I think that would be probably useful. And if we want to have an entire show on Turbopack at some point, I'm sure we could open that up as well. So Turbopack obviously is or maybe not obviously, it's the rewritten Webpack in Rust, or it's the succession to Webpack. And Next.js has been running on Webpack for very long. And what problems have you hit so that you need to build Turbopack?
Yeah, it's definitely a long journey on a Webpack. When we released Next.js, it was initially built on Webpack, and this is quite some time ago. So 2016. We've been around, as they say, in terms of framework land. Like we survived for a long time. Similar to the rest of the industry, like basically what is happening, like over these 7 years, is that people start building larger and larger and larger apps on these frameworks, right? So like it's not just on Next.js, it's also on like Next and other frameworks. So what we see is that people just end up pulling in more modules, more npm packages, more like larger UI libraries. So like UI libraries, you might think of like they're probably shipping like 100 components, right? But like if you look at some of the newer like libraries, like I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus here, actually. Some of the new libraries are shipping like 10,000 re-exports, right? Like they're shipping like 10,000 different components that you can import. But in order to process those, we need to compile all those 10,000 modules and then say which one is actually used, and like skip. Like we can't really like skip over a bunch of these. And sometimes you do like import star as like some library name, and that means we have to compile all of them, right? Like that kind of thing. So as the complexity of like JavaScript applications keeps growing, we're basically like hitting these limits of Webpack itself, of like some of the newer bundlers even. So what we started out with is like we were basically evaluating like, does it even make sense to keep like running a Next.js or like running Next.js on Webpack, or should we use some of the like newer bundlers that came out or anything like that? And then when we looked at the complexity of the apps that we already get with Next.js today, as well as all the complexity of like extra bundling for server components, client components, like multiple passes. Maybe you want to deploy on the edge or Node.js, and then like there's like just like a complexity in the amount of modules that get processed. So one example of that is like if you have a client component, like as you probably know, but maybe not everyone knows, client components render on the server as well to render HTML to basically speed up the initial render. In order to get there, we need to take your module, and your module is like importing, say, like large icon library that is the like 10,000 re-exports, for example. Now we need to process those 10,000 modules for the server as well as for the client, because they're in different conditions. Like they get like different optimizations. They need to be like, maybe those like for the browser need to be ES5 versus like the server can be like whatever like Node.js version you're running, that kind of thing. And that means we have to process all of them pretty quickly. But what it means in practice, instead of 10,000 modules, you're processing 20,000 modules, right? And that like stacks up really quickly as you get like more and more modules into your client components, into your server components, that kind of thing. So we really had to build like a solution for how can I like optimize these very large graphs and like make sure that everything is like processed in a way that is reliable as well. Because like for Webpack, like Webpack doesn't support running both server and client compilation in the same compiler. So what we do for Webpack is we run 3 compilers. We run one for the server, one for the client, and one for Edge. Like Edge is the like special target where like you get a slightly more constrained environment. In order to do that, like to coordinate that, like we have to manually coordinate like you start now, you start then type thing. Like this one is done, now we need to trigger this other one. And we just knew that wasn't like as reliable as we wanted to be. So eventually we started building Turbopack, or what turned into Turbopack, which is like a single, like the idea was we create a single module graph that can span the server, components, client components, Edge, like whatever you run into. And it can just process all of those modules in parallel, because like Webpack is limited to single core right now. You can add some parallelization, but like it's not super, it doesn't speed up things that much. We leverage all the latest like compiler technology or like transform technology, like SWC.
Yeah.
We implement caching from the start. It's like one of the issues that like Webpack had from the start was that they didn't start with like it was a research project by Tobias. Like the original story of Webpack is pretty interesting as well, but like it turned into this thing that everyone used. But in this, like from the start, it wasn't built to be this thing that everyone used. So over time, they had to like optimize a lot, add more caches, add ad hoc caches into the system, add disk caching on top of it, and things like that. And what we did for Turbopack is we started out with the caching layer. Like we need to have like a task runner caching layer that is like as solid as it can be, so that you basically get reliability from the start across like parallelizing across like many CPUs.
Yeah.
Like caching for disk, that kind of thing. And then we can build like any tooling we want on top of that. So we basically built like a library called Turbo Engine. Turbo Engine is the thing that is like powering all of Turbopack and potentially in the future also part of Turbo Repo, because they recently rewrote everything in Rust. And the way that this works is that any function you write in Rust, you can like basically annotate with this like function directive from Turbo Engine, and that makes it cached by default automatically. It knows when to rerun when you like do disk IO, for example, and it just like automatically works out of the box with that. What you get with like having this caching layer is that now anytime you make a change, we can quickly recompute, does this thing need to, like what thing changed and what thing needs to be recomputed? And we only recompute that like narrow part of the graph. So that means that anytime you make a like initial compile, it still like compiles all your modules, right?
Yeah.
But then when you make a change, it can just like recompile only the CSS, or it can recompile only the like tiny part of the JavaScript that needs to be recompiled, and then apply it on the server, apply it on the client through like fast refresh or anything like that.
Okay.
It's like one of the goals was also to bring like fast refresh down to like sub 100 milliseconds or so.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
For like pretty much all changes, except for server components, because server components also needs to render like on the server. So we re-render the entire page in that case. If you're changing like client components, it's like near instant, basically, right? The problem we had with Webpack was that like it's not near instant when you have these like 20,000 modules or 30,000 modules.
Yeah.
Because that like graph of changes is like massive in the Webpack case. So it would take 1-2 seconds before you see anything on the screen. And if you were unlucky, you would get like a much larger recompile, and it would take much longer than that even. So that was one of them. And then the other is that most of the things that people are complaining about are not recompile times. Actually, it's the initial compile.
Mm-hmm.
So which is like, I boot up the server, I go to a page. How long does it take me to show that page? And we're compiling those on demand, right? So that means we're basically shifting the work from like you boot up the server and then you wait for 5 minutes, which is like what you would get with some of the like initial like versions of like compilers that were built on top of Webpack, for example. Instead, what we do is we only like start compiling when you actually request like a page, and we only compile the stuff for that page. For that, the parallelization is like a big optimization, as well as having persistent caching.
Yeah.
It's like parallelization we have nailed down, and that works. What is really interesting is that for the Vercel website, what we saw is that on some of the slower pages, Webpack with a cache, like disk caching, would actually be 10% slower than Turbopack doing everything from scratch. So that was like one of the interesting like wins that we had, and like comparing it to like running it against like cold Webpack would be even like better, obviously. But the so that was like one of the things that was really interesting to see, and this is without us having persistent caching in Turbopack yet. So that's what we're working on right now, to have like persistent caching, so that if Scott starts to work on the syntax website, like he makes some changes, might not be working on it every day, right? So you make some changes, you push them to production, and then you like wind down the server. So you like Control C and you just go ahead with your day. And the next day you come back and you start up again. You have to wait like this initial compile time again because there's no disk caching yet. Now, when we have disk caching, you can just like go from the point where you left off, right? So like the last time you ran the compiler. And now you might be thinking like, oh, but this might make sense for builds as well, right? Because my builds are in the cloud, and maybe they can like store all of that and then like restore it and make my builds almost instant, because you just told me about this like smaller graph that can just recompile changes. Well, that's the case. So like we can do that with Turbopack as well.
Nice.
Once we have Turbopack built.
Yeah.
That's something we're working on right now. That's like 83% of tests passing on the Nextjs mono repo.
Wow.
And what that means is like your recompiles for production builds are going to be not blocked on recompiling the code itself anymore. They're going to be like blocked on like static generation being slower, things like that.
So you put that together with Turbo Repo, which may skip all your npm installs and all that, and you could potentially be having like second deploy times. Yeah,
the idea is, I mean, like personally, I grew up in the like FTP era. Right. Like I just throw stuff onto the platform, which is like I'm literally editing in production, right?
Yeah.
In my Dreamweaver, like editor is just like connected to production.
Yeah, you FTP right into the box and hit save, deploy.
Yeah, totally.
And obviously, like there's people that I've talked to that are slightly younger than me, like literally slightly, because I'm not that old, but that just never did that, right? And they just like they're like, yeah, my compiles take like a few minutes, and then like it's live. It's still like magical, right? Like it's one of the things that drew me to working at Vercel. It's like it's so magical when you did this like now command and you would just see a live URL. Suddenly, like similar to how you did it with the FTP box as well. However, now you get all this like benefits of like isolation of environments, so you can like send this to your colleagues and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
without actually bringing down prod, right? Like changing things that are like breaking things.
Yeah, beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all this info. I don't want to keep you too long, so we'll move into the last section we have here, which is our sick picks and shameless plugs. I'm not sure if you came prepared with those.
I think I have like one. I'm kind of into sci-fi series. And if you're into sci-fi series, I highly recommend Apple TV Plus, which is like, for some reason, they keep putting out more sci-fi series. We don't have particular, like here in the Netherlands, because I'm not from the US, like they don't have like specific like sci-fi channels, like the sci-fi channel itself, and that kind of thing. It's like a lot of that it's like on Apple TV. So
I don't think I realized how many different sci-fi shows they had, because I guess is Silo considered sci-fi, or Foundation for All of Mankind, Invasion? Like, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Like overall, I'd never thought of like Apple TV before, and like I opened it once accidentally. I was like, this is interesting. There seems to be like quite interesting like series on there. So like Silo is pretty good. That's sci-fi. It's all. I think they made a lot of deals with like book authors as well, because they're just based on the books a lot. They're now also getting like into the like documentary about controversial thing that happened, like the Hollywood Con Queen started watching recently, which is by the creators of the Fire Festival
really?
like documentary and things
I'm
like
into that.
Yeah, those are there's some pretty good stuff there. So if you're interested in sci-fi, Foundation is really good as well. It's definitely like they keep bringing out like more of those. I'm not sure, like there must be someone in like Apple HQ that's like, I love sci-fi and I want more.
I bet. I wonder if they have just serious data on podcast listens too, because I know that Hollywood Con Queen podcast was really hit. So I wonder if they saw that and were like, oh, this would be a good docu. Huh. Cool.
Awesome. And shameless plugs. What would you like to plug to our audience?
I think Turbopack RC, or like the Turbopack RC.
Yeah.
So we have the Nexus 15 RC, which is like new features using like React 19, some caching improvements as well. If you like didn't like the previous caching, we disabled most of it. And it's all up there now. Mm-hmm. We're definitely like listening to feedback there. Which is like too complicated from the start. Like we tried to make it very similar to like Pages Writer with like automatic static generation, but it became like complicated in the cases where you do want to be dynamic, right? So like there are just like better defaults now. You can opt into more static behavior once you want to like optimize more, basically. It's purely based on feedback and like just giving people the thing that they want to like build better websites. Besides that, Turbopack is in RC for development now. So that means please try it out. If you have any issue, like literally any issue, if it's slow, anything like that, tweet at me or open an issue on GitHub. We're actively working on it. We have like 30 open issues left so far before like development is fully done. And then we'll shift to like work on builds as well, and like bring you that like persistent caching and like FTP like builds and things like that.
Sweet, yeah. I'm excited for that.
I have one more shameless plug as well, which you'll like. Yeah, no worries. It's about Sentry actually. So
okay, let's hear it.
I'm not sure if you know. I think his name is Luca. So Luca on the like Sentry Next.js SDK team. Has been doing some contributions to Next to basically allow us to or allow Sentry to reason about server-side errors.
Yeah.
That are then sent to the client with a special like digest. I'm not sure if you've seen that in NextJS, but like we need to hide like all the data because we don't want you like a server-side error. You don't want that to end up in the client because like in some cases it contains anything that could be secret. Mm-hmm. But now Sentry can actually reason about that particular like error that happened on the server, as well as the thing that happened on the client. So that thing you saw on the client. So you can actually mark the session as like, this is the error that was related to that particular like digest. So you can search for the digest in the UI as well, which is pretty neat.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, we'll link that up as well. Sentry's doing a lot for that. I know you guys did some work on the hydration stuff. Sentry been constantly working on getting better hydration issues, and the source maps is one thing Sentry is spending a ton of time on pushing forward in JavaScript in general. So love to see it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of your time for coming on. Thank you so much for Next.js, working on it, as well as coming on today to school us on all of the stuff that's going on with React and Next.js. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan.